Millions of Americans have taken advantage of direct-to-consumer genetic testing services offered by companies such as 23andMe, which is reportedly facing financial challenges. If past actions by other companies are any indication, it's possible that 23andMe could offer itself and its assets, including millions of people's data, for sale. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm talking with Sara Gerke, an associate professor of law at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Professor Gerke has co-authored a perspective article about what happens to consumers' personal data during corporate changes. Professor Gerke, what types of services do 23andMe and similar companies offer, and what data do they collect from customers?
These direct-to-consumer companies, they are collecting massive amounts of data. So that's like, first of all, your saliva sample, genetic information. You can, in addition, add several other information, such as your health-related information, your family history. And so it's really a lot of data that is being collected.
And then what's been reported about the financial status of 23andMe? What's prompted these discussions about whether the company might potentially file for bankruptcy?
Yeah, so we have seen that, unfortunately, in the media in the last couple of months, that 23andMe is really on the brink of bankruptcy. So the stock price fell extremely. There were also like some challenges with regard to a massive data breach in 2023. And so there were a lot of discussion about should we take the company private? But right now, the future of 23andMe is uncertain, but is likelihood that it could go bankrupt at some point in the future.
So, what laws govern the transfer of customer data in business transactions, including sales of entire companies?
So this is a very good question, and it's a little bit more complicated because it's not just like the entire system is more focused on privacy laws. And then, of course, we are going to have bankruptcy law in addition if a company goes bankrupt. And so the problem which we are seeing in the US is that we do not have comprehensive data privacy laws. And we have a lot what we are seeing at the state level, but the entire system in itself has a lot of weaknesses and doesn't protect consumers' privacy properly. So consumers and customers of 23andMe do not necessarily have proper control over what happens to their data. And so what we are really focusing mostly on in the US is relying heavily on these privacy statements that companies like 23andMe have in place.
You do say in your article, though, that the bankruptcy system includes some safeguards that are lacking in non-bankruptcy transactions. So what additional safeguards are in place?
So the bankruptcy system doesn't help us completely, but it does have a little bit of safeguards. So for example, a bankruptcy is a public process, so it draws a lot of attention to regulators. So we could have, for example, the Federal Trade Commission that decides to step in if needed. So that's already a good thing. Also, we do have the federal courts that oversee bankruptcy sales. And then in addition, there are sometimes cases where there's an ombudsman that actually investigates the sale and also makes sure that the companies comply with their privacy statements. But in general, a lot of scholars have shown weaknesses in the bankruptcy system, and it ultimately does not necessarily stop a sale of customers' data to the highest bidder.
So what options exist for consumers when companies consider selling their personal data?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's only partial relief what's currently existing. So it's a little bit of a frustration on a bad situation here. So what customers can do, they can just decide to be proactive. At this point, if they're worried about their data with 23andMe and its future, they could delete completely their account. Though I will say that this only provides partial relief because the data, which was already, for example, being used in research, if you consented to that, can no longer be retracted. Also, 23andMe is going to retain specific information. So it clearly says in its privacy statement that even if you decide to delete your account, that it's going to keep information on sex, birth dates, also genetic information for compliance purposes.
And then finally, what steps could U.S. policymakers take to strengthen protections for consumers in these kinds of circumstances?
Ideally, we would hope that at some point the US is actually going to enact a comprehensive federal privacy law that then applies really to all personal data, the processing of personal data, including collecting the data, storage, so everything, including genetic data and health data, and also that it applies in bankruptcy cases. So we see in other jurisdictions like the EU has a general data protection regulation, which is much broader than what we have here in the US. In the US, we have HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. But HIPAA is pretty narrow in its scope because it only applies to so-called protected health information that is generated by HIPAA-covered entities or business associates. And again, companies like 23andMe do not fall under HIPAA right now. Of course, to get these large-scale privacy reforms through Congress is going to be really difficult, and we have not seen anything going through so far. Another approach would be just do a little bit less and say to expand just specific federal laws, which we already have in place, like HIPAA. We could broaden the scope of HIPAA and include companies like 23andMe. We also have GINA, which helps to prevent discrimination for genetic information. But again, GINA only applies to the data used by employers or health insurers. So we could also imagine that we expand the scope of GINA and cover also the sale of genetic information in bankruptcy. But again, it all requires Congress to act. And the best approach would be to have at some point something at the federal level. That would be much more beneficial than what we are currently seeing, a patchwork of state laws, which are hard to keep up with and comply with. And so in general, our perspective piece should just really start this discussion to think about how we should actually regulate such data.
Thank you, Professor Gerke.